So the first concept is defensive aggro, which basically means that when you cast a must-answer threat, it creates a situation where either your opponent answers your threat so that the game plays on, or they play their own threat, but then you're happy because you untap with your must-answer threat. Um, a famous example would be Dark Confidant. If your opponent's tapped out and you cast Dark Confidant, your opponent can either remove it and then they pass back to you, or they can play their own threat, like their own Dark Confidant. But then that's a good position for you because you untapped with your very good threat. It's a very important concept with this deck um, because this deck is often weak to your opponent's threats. So um, by playing your own threats, you stop them from casting their spells. Uh, um, and that's basically the concept. And it can come up against Domain, for example, and Golgari, because, for example, Golgari is a deck where people might say, um, I don't want to play my Emberheart Challenger because my opponent could go for the Throat It. But if your opponent has Preacher of Viscous in their deck, if you don't play your Emberheart, they can untap, play Preacher, and then now you're in a pretty bad position. Whereas if you played Emberheart, then um, if they were tapped out or something, if they played their Preacher, at least you get to untap with your Emberheart. And what you're accomplishing there is you're giving yourself more time to develop yourself so that when they play a Preacher, it's later in the game and it'll have less effect. Because, for example, now if they kill your Emberheart, then next turn you can play Sentinel or get towards kicking Manifold Mouse or play Druid or whatever. So that's the first concept. The second is about Elspeths Smite. And there's a variety of decks that play it. The most popular is Domain. And I think the key question you want to ask is when you're playing against a deck like Domain, they pass with mana up. The question you want to ask is, if I don't attack, how does my opponent spend their mana? And if they don't spend their mana, is that good for me? Because, for example, if they pass with only 2 mana up, Leyline Binding usually costs 3-4 mana, so they often can't cast that. Um, and if they cast, so they can have like Get Lost, they can have Right Ends, they have Elspeths Smite. But the point is, a lot of their deck is sorceries. So one of the main ways they can actually spend their mana that turn is on a card that removes a tapped creature. So often, if your opponent has Ride's End, you might not want to attack with your Emberheart because you can say, well, here's the situations that can happen. Either they can get lost from Emberheart, which it doesn't matter if I attack or not, or I attack with my Emberheart, and now they're able to Elspeth Smite or Ride's End it, and they're able to use mana and remove the Emberheart. And what's the advantage of attacking? Is I got 2 damage in, which doesn't seem like the biggest advantage in the world. So it doesn't mean never attack, but I think people attack too much, and that's the question to ask: is if I don't attack, what are they going to spend their mana on, and am I happy with that? And you can really take advantage of the fact that Domain doesn't play a lot of instants, so you can really know what the options they have when they pass to you. And this goes into the same thing. It's about when you play against Pixie. I think one of the best ways to beat Pixie is by getting a mana advantage against them. Because if they pass with 2 mana and you play quest and you use a turn to play Innkeeper's Talent, your pass with Questing Druid, that can be really backbreaking for them because now they have to untap. If they don't have sideboard card like Destroy Evil, but now they have to untap. They weren't able to cast their Nowhere to Run, and you developed. So you basically got a mana advantage on them, and it can be even stronger than that because um, it's they play cards like Pixie bounces their own cards. Like a lot of their cards want Nowhere to Run to be in play to function. So if they can't play Nowhere to Run on turn 2, then they're not able to cast that Fear of Isolation or that Pixie on that turn. So that was a concept I was going to talk about. Is a good way to win against Pixie is getting a mana advantage. So you can think about, are there ways I can make it so they can't spend their mana this turn, so they can't develop. Then the fourth one is about Mulligans. The deck is mana hungry, but it has a low curve. So I noticed this. The fact that the deck has a low curve can cause confusion with people with Mulligans. One thing I notice is I feel people overrate Monstrous Rage a lot with Mulligans. Like, people will see Monstrous Rage in their opening hand, so they'll be like, wow, that card's really strong, I don't want a Mulligan. But what is this? Why is Monstrous Rage good? Part of why it's good is it's 1 mana, which means it's very mana efficient. But if you have too many, like if you're going to have dead mana in the game because your hand is too many lands, then you're not using the maximizing the strengths of Monstrous Rage. So usually, like, it doesn't mean 4-land hands are bad, but often 4-lands hands, like 4 lands, 2 Monstrous Rage. I mean, I imagine most people would mulligan, right? But when it's 4 lands, 1 Monstrous Rage, um, that's something to keep in mind. Part of why it's good is that it's cheap and you're not playing to its maximum effectiveness. If you're keeping hands with too low spells. Another thing is that the deck's curve being very low can make how many lands you want in your opening hand interesting. Because for example, if you mulligan and you have 3 lands in your hand, a lot of times people are nervous to put back the 3rd land because they don't want to miss the land drop. But since the deck's curve is so low, and the most expensive spell is 3, it means that if you bottom the 3rd land, your draw steps, you're either going to draw probably 1 or 2 mana spells you can cast, or a land to cast your 3 drop. Whereas if you keep the 3rd land, now you could draw 4th or 5th land. It doesn't mean that it's good to bottom the 3rd land or whatever, but it's just something to keep in mind that it's fine to often bottom a 3rd land. And the last thing is on playing the deck. I would say that part of why I think Gruul is difficult to play is that, like in Magic in general, there's always pros and cons to different lines, advantages and disadvantages. But the thing about Gruul is that the decision trees are very, very big, so a lot of things can happen. I think a good shortcut is ask, how does this go badly for me, to organize that. An example would be if you're playing blue-black mid-range in Standard, and your opening hand is uh, and you have Deep Cavern Bat, Go for the Throat, 2 Preacher lands, and you're playing in red, and they play a mountain, and they pass you, and it's your second turn. And your option is you can play Deep Cavern Bat or you can pass. And I think the quickest way to think about that is you can be like, well, what's the downside to playing Deep Cavern Bat? Well, obviously they could shock it, and then it's mana inefficient, but also you can't. Now they can spend their second turn playing a 2-drop, and you want to play your Preacher on turn 3, but then you're giving them the chance to untap with a 2-drop. So then you're like, okay, should I pass with Go for the Throat? And you're like, well, what's the disadvantage of playing Go for the Throat? Well, the disadvantage is that if they don't play a creature, then you can't spend your mana to develop. Because, for example, if they play Innkeeper's Talent, or if they pass with Questing Druid up, then you're going to have 2 dead mana. So then you weigh the pros and cons. But then you might just be like, well, I have 2 creatures, I really want to cast my Preacher, so I'll pass with Go for the Throat, because if they play whatever, then I'll just play my Preacher, and it maximizes that. So that's the video, I guess.